Let me put each defendant to represent the prosecution's case against them. Let's do reasonable doubt standards, like they're guilty based on the case prosecutor makes. But this obviously means it's not convincing at all. They're garbage. This means it's split, so they make a case but it's not convincing, so it's just uncertain. And then this one would be more like it's very likely they did it, but not quite with reasonable doubt. So it's putting the onus more on them to make a very compelling case, as if it was real life almost. So here are the factors. Witness testimony. Could be physical evidence, or like hard evidence, decisive evidence. That's basically what they call it in the games. Circumstantial. So that's kind of more like the theories they come up with. They say it's very likely, like Max did it because he can fly and he's the only one who could have done it without leaving footprints. But that doesn't actually prove anything. It's just a theory based on some assumption you're making. So it can be persuasive, but it's not very strong on its own. So what I think is going to happen here, I think that a lot of these are going to fall into one of two categories. And that shows you how weak some of the cases actually are. That's why everything is so unfair against Phoenix and stacked against Phoenix, is because most of these prosecution cases are going to be either relying fully on witness testimony or relying fully on circumstantial evidence. Very few of them have decisive or what I call physical evidence, which would be like, oh, the murder weapon with Edgeworth's fingerprints from Turnabout Goodbyes. It's like he has his fingerprints on the gun. That's physical hard evidence. The reason why that's rare, and in that case he just does it because he's stupid and picks it up for no reason, right? He doesn't have to do it. The reason why that's hard to do or hard to find in these cases is because they're not actually guilty. So that's the kind of evidence you won't find when the client is actually innocent. So, you know, it's very rare that you see that towards someone who's actually innocent in the end. Or even like when Adrian does it to Matt, she puts the button and she puts the knife with Unguard's fingerprints. It's still a setup. So even though he actually did hire the killer, he wasn't actually there. So even that physical evidence has to be planted. So you always have to be weary of physical evidence. It's never actually legitimate with an innocent client. At least that's the trend of the series. So let's see. First case is the case against Larry Butts. So again, we have our criteria here. The 3 factors. They have witness testimony to use. They can use hard evidence or physical evidence. They can use circumstantial evidence, which is more theory-based than actual having fingerprints or something tangible to the suspect. So the first case is Winston Payne is the prosecutor. Frank Swahid, however you say it. Frank Swahid is the actual culprit. Larry Butts is the defendant. So how good is the case against Larry? Let's think about it. You have no physical evidence, right? He was there, but even that they have to ask him, were you there? So he doesn't admit to it. So they have a witness testimony which they rely on heavily. That's obviously the actual culprit. So you have a fake witness testimony, but I won't say it's fake. Like, you have a witness testimony. You don't have any physical evidence, right? His fingerprints presumably could have been on the thinker because he made it, but they don't actually mention that, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think they ever mention in that case fingerprints. But presumably they at least have that. As far as circumstantial evidence, they have, well, he was there supposedly, but that's even based on witness testimony. And they were supposedly having a fight, which Payne kind of drags out, but they say she had sugar daddy, she was seeing other men, she had just come back from a trip. So the passport is like circumstantial evidence to show, oh, she's off dating other men, hanging out with sugar daddies in Paris or wherever. Therefore, he has a motive to kill. So that's very circumstantial, but that's not bad. The only thing they don't mention that would make it a strong case is whether his fingerprints were on the thinker or not. I guess they would have to be, but it's amazing and very Winston Payne-like to not mention such a major fact. I'm almost positive they never mention it. So because of that, I'll say it's a decent case. You're relying heavily on the witness, which obviously backfires horribly. Physical evidence is basically a no-show. That's why it's not top tier. And circumstantial evidence is reasonable. I'm almost trying to apply a real life standard to it a little bit, but just, again, she was obviously seeing other men. They had stopped talking, so you could prove that with phone records and stuff. And so that gives a reasonable motive. And just the fact that he was there, but I guess that hinges too much on the testimony too. The main weakness here is physical evidence. There's not much, if any, really. Let me try to think if there was any other piece that ties Larry to the crime. The only thing is the thinker. And like I said, they don't mention the fingerprints, so it's either Winston Payne is just a complete moron, which I guess he's supposed to be, and just forgets to mention it. Or maybe I'm forgetting, but I'm pretty sure they don't bring it up there. Let's go to the second case. Is Maya Fey. This is going to be Edgeworth Prosecution and Red White who actually did it. So they rely a lot on witness testimony. This is also a set up testimony, even though it's not. We'll separate the two as well. So Red White is trying to implicate Phoenix, so we're not going to involve him in the Maya Fey situation. So Maya is just the first day in court, so that testimony is very well set up. The way that Red White plans the murder, and he knows that April's gonna say exactly what he wants her to say. Even though it doesn't work that way, that's well planned out. So the testimony is strong, or at least they're relying on it, and it's what does she say exactly? That she looks like a girlish figure. So again, they have the testimony. They don't really have physical evidence. See, Maya's fingerprints aren't on the thinker, I don't think, because she never had a chance to pick it up from her sister. That's what she was coming there to do. So you can say for certainty there is no physical evidence. She didn't pick up the thinker, which is the murder weapon, and there's no other physical evidence that she would have. You can't say, oh, her fingerprints are somewhere else in the office because it's her sister's office. She could have been there 1,000 times. At least the thinker is recent evidence. So this also has no physical evidence whatsoever. The note is more like circumstantial evidence. Oh, she wrote her name to tell you the culprit, which is very flaky. You know, how often does that really happen? But even if we take that into account, you're relying on one piece of paper with Maya written in blood that you can't even prove was written by the victim. So that's weak. And witness testimony you're relying on very heavily, really almost entirely. I'm going to put this one in the hung category. It's a pretty weak case, honestly, so you have to give Edgeworth some credit. April May says she did it. That's pretty much the whole backbone of the case. And again, Maya's written in blood. That's the whole reason why Gumshoe arrests her too. But it's not a very strong or compelling piece because it could just be saying, hey Maya, I love you before I die. You know what I mean? There's so many ways to explain it. It doesn't mean that she did it. And of course we know that the victim didn't even write it, but even if they had, that doesn't mean they did it. So again, you're lacking in both of these cases physical evidence, especially in this one. She has how come fingerprints are so ignored in this series? They never mention, at least in these early cases, they don't mention Larry's fingerprints on the thinker, even though they're presumably there. They don't mention Maya's fingerprints not being on the thinker, because they wouldn't be on the thinker. I'll add some more factors. See, big factor. Do they rely on only one of the three? Do they have all three in some form? Even if they're not very compelling on their own, is the primary witness the culprit? Which you might not think matters, but that is kind of a danger zone. Not that they would necessarily know that going in, although you can't put it past Edgeworth to figure that out. Or obviously Von Karma knows. So like if your primary witness, like in case 1, is the actual culprit, you're opening yourself up to be accused yourself, which completely throws out your testimony to begin with. Not to mention, now we have the actual answer. So both the culprit and the prosecution should want to avoid that. Case 2, that's not true. April May is at least not the culprit, even though she wiretapped and stuff. Alright, now we're going to do case 2, part 2, day 2. Which is where Red White tries to implicate Phoenix in a very brazen and self-destructive way. So let me think about, why does it even make sense that Phoenix is accused? He was at the scene by his own admission, by Maya's admission. Everyone acknowledges that Phoenix was at the scene. He was actually there when Gumshoe arrives. So there's no denying that he was at the scene. I don't think anyone tries to dispute that in court. So the question is, what do they have against him? So you have fairly strong testimony by Red White very aggressively, basically claiming it was you, it was him. The problem with this from the get-go is you're conflicting with April May so clearly that how can you go from day one of the trial to saying Maya did it, April said she did it, blood on the note, and it's a credit to Red White's ability to pressure and manipulate things. This would never happen in real life where like day one of a trial, or even if it lasted several days, one person's accused, then they accuse the other person who is there, which is Phoenix, and then they just throw out what happened in the first trial. April May's testimony doesn't matter. She saw a girl, it doesn't matter. Now all of a sudden it's a guy. Like, you don't get to just change it like that. So the testimony, while very directly implicating Phoenix, doesn't really jive with what happened before. I know they probably threw out April's testimony. In fact, I think they say that even Phoenix keeps one portion in his court record, the only portion that's kept, where he says like, oh, they went to the left side, right side. And then you catch Red White on that too. But physical evidence against Phoenix, there's pretty much none. His fingerprints are presumably on the thinker because he handled it in the case, but maybe not. And circumstantial evidence, really just the fact that he was there. They don't go through any motive. Why would he kill his boss? They don't go through, what could you come up with? He wants to take over the office himself after his first case. There's no sign of struggle. No evidence that he struggled. It's not like he's cut or wounded or anything, unless you want to include being punched by Red White, but that happened after the first day of trial, so that wouldn't even work. So they have a very weak case. This is one of the weakest, especially since the April May testimony completely does not jive with it. So that one would be not guilty. The only reason it stands is because Red White has the judge and people in his pocket. That's the only reason. It's such a bad case. Witness testimony by the culprit, which conflicts with the previous testimony given very blatantly. I don't know how you can reconcile that. Then the physical evidence is, again, limited. Maybe fingerprints on the thinker, maybe not. They don't even mention it. Nothing to show that Phoenix did anything. The note that says Maya on it is even circumstantial, but they don't even have that for Phoenix. There's absolutely nothing. In fact, if I was Phoenix, I would have just said, hey, the note proves Maya did it, not me. Like, there's no note saying my name. So now in your trial, since Maya's already innocent, supposedly, now they say it's double jeopardy. So let me accuse Maya actually did do it, and that note proves it. So I didn't do it if I'm Phoenix. So now you can use that to your advantage. That's how weak of a case it is. So let's do the third case now. This is with D. Vasquez as the culprit. Again, Edgeworth as the prosecutor. So really the point of this is we're basically grading how good is the case of the prosecution. So apparently Winston Payne so far did the best job. And the main reason why, even though the culprit is the witness, the primary witness, again, I'm assuming certain things, which maybe I shouldn't, but since Larry made the thinker, his fingerprints are bound to be on it. And since she was seeing other men, he has a motive, and the witness testimony does directly implicate him. So it's a strong case, mostly due to his clown behavior, but the case here is just so weak, and hers is okay. Again, you rely too much on that Maya written in blood. Her fingerprints wouldn't be on the thinker, and again, there's no indication, again, she's not cut or there's no struggle signs on her body, which would be a form of physical evidence if you could somehow prove that like they fought, but there's no sign of that whatsoever. And actually, you can even use the wiretap conversation, which nobody knew about at first, or the recorded conversation, to say that Maya and her were on good terms. They were going to have dinner. So then you would have to prove as the prosecution they had a fight after that. So I could leave it at, listen to this recording, this is the last time they spoke that we have, and you could say, look, they were on good terms, she was going to hold evidence for her, they were going to have dinner, burgers or whatever. That's what they were coming to meet. So how do you go from that to Maya kills Mia? You don't get to speculate there, you have to prove, oh, they had a fight over this, or show us that conversation. So that's extremely weak as well. Now we go to Will Powers. So let's think about what they base this case on. Again, it's Edgeworth, so we have to give him some respect, but how good is the actual case? And I guess I'm also criticizing the police work for being so sloppy and not looking into anything. Like, they don't look at Studio 2 at all. They just don't even look at it. they just take Oldbag's word for it and say nothing happened at Studio 2, it was closed off, we don't care, or because of the monkey's head or whatever. A lot of the time the investigation gets basic facts wrong, like the murder weapon and the time of death and stuff like that. But Will Powers, if you have Oldbag implicating him through testimony, then who else testifies the second day? The little kid does. Who testifies first on the second day? Someone, is it Penny? Or I can't remember who else testified. But they have at least several different people testify. So Oldbag implicates Will Powers. The little kid doesn't really implicate anybody. Although circumstantially, I guess he does. He says, oh, the Steel Samurai killed the evil magistrate or whatever. And then he says he wasn't even looking. He couldn't watch. And then Dee Vasquez comes last to then implicate again. Or really, she plays more defense. She doesn't really accuse him directly. She just tries to stay out of it, like, oh, I was just at the studio. So she doesn't really even implicate him at all, because she couldn't have witnessed it where she was. So you really only have Oldbag giving a strong, incriminating testimony, and even that's reduced to, you just saw the guy in his costume. So a costume doesn't prove anything. That's very circumstantial. You say anybody could be wearing that costume. You wouldn't even have to prove who. You would have to prove it was him. You would have to prove it's Will Powers. You could otherwise just say it's anybody. And it turns out to be, obviously, Jack Hammer. So that's very flaky. So you have several different witness testimonies, but I don't remember if Penny, let me check one thing. Turnabout. I'm sure someone else testifies on day 2 before the kid. So it must be Penny, and I just forgot. Oh, it's the director. I'm mistaken. It was the director who testifies, Sal Mandela. But either way, you're relying on testimony that doesn't directly implicate him. Physical evidence, there's really none. You could say the spear doesn't even turn out to be the murder weapon. His fingerprints might not even be on it, because he's always wearing a costume and gloves. I'm not even sure if that comes into play. So through 3 or 4 different ones, we still haven't gotten a good fingerprints on the murder weapon, hard evidence. That's one of the best things to get, and we will be getting it for case 4, but that's the thing you like to see the most, is fingerprints on the murder weapon. So what circumstantial evidence was there even? It was like, again, the costume, that doesn't prove anything, that's weak. The spear doesn't prove anything, that's weak, even assuming it did turn out to be the actual murder weapon. It's just mediocre. Like, I can't say it's not guilty, but it's like very weak. It almost doesn't warrant consideration because, again, it's the costume, it's the spear. Anybody could use the costume, anybody could use the spear. So that doesn't prove anything. That strikes the testimony and the circumstantial evidence. Or, I mean, that's all it is. There's no physical evidence. He was asleep in his room. You can't prove he wasn't. There's even physical evidence showing that he was drugged. You could probably drug test him, see that the sleeping pills were in his system, and that he was drugged. The fingerprints of Jack Hammer are on the bottle. So it almost goes the other way. I'm actually going to put him here, slightly above Phoenix's case. But yeah, that really is very weak. What would happen there is at least he'd be not guilty. You might not find out that Vasquez did it, but at the very least you'd say there's no reason to really suspect him. So now we get into turnabout goodbyes, and we say, again, I'll start with the obvious one. His fingerprints are on the murder weapon. He admits to being at the scene. So even as smart of a character as he is, he does 2 stupid things. He could pretend to not be there, and then it's his word against the witnesses. Unfortunately, there's 2 witnesses, but Talata didn't actually see anything. So you're relying on the culprit as one witness, and then you're relying on someone who didn't actually see anything and just wants to get attention and a lot of heart. So that's not as good as it could be. Yogi does give a very direct testimony, like Edgeworth says, oh, he can't believe he's dead as he passed by the window. So that is very direct incrimination, but even his testimony is weak just because, like, he's this old man without a name, without fingerprints, so he seems suspect from the get-go. Physical evidence, like I said, is very strong. But this would be leaning more towards the guilty category. Just based on that alone, your fingerprints are on the murder weapon, he picked it up for no reason, he didn't have to, no need. So that's his own stupidity, he shouldn't have touched it. So without that, how strong is the case? Like, pretend his fingerprints weren't on the gun. Then how strong is the case? Witness testimony of Lana Hart is pretty mediocre. You have the photo, which at best shows that Edgeworth was there on the boat, which it doesn't even show that, but assuming they could establish that he was there, and he even admits he was there, that's circumstantial. So you say he's there at the scene, you say the caretaker says he goes on the boat, that was the only boat on the lake, according to Lada. So it is kind of a well thought out situation by Von Karma, who wrote the letter detailing what to do. Then you fire twice to create the witness, you jump out. But the only issue is the time discrepancy, if you could establish in an autopsy that it doesn't match. So there were 2 events on the boat, if you will. Or the first one wasn't on the boat, it was just in the shack. So the testimony is probably the weakest part, but because Lada's is completely garbage. Yanni's isn't bad. Physical evidence is amazing, very strong. Circumstantial evidence is just, again, that he admits to being there, and the motive also is decent because he's the one who got his father's killer off the hook, or presumed killer, in Yanni Yogi, as we know. What was his name? Oh, you don't know his name. Anyway, so it turns out to be Yogi, right? So what did they call him before that? Like in court and stuff. I just always think of him as Yanni Yogi, so what do they call him until they find that out? So he doesn't even give his name. So again, that's mainly on the strength of the physical evidence for once. So let's go to Lana. And it's just the extreme nature of the circumstance. 2 guys on one boat in the middle of the lake at night, nobody else is around. You know, you're putting yourself in a very precarious spot by doing that. And you pick up the gun like an absolute clown moron. Let's go to Lana Sky. And I'm trying to frame it in a way that I'm not assuming what we find out in trial. I'm thinking about making the case at the outset, because then you could always say, like, oh, for example, this one, the real scene is in the evidence room. It's not even at the prosecutor's office. But going into it, you wouldn't know that. So how compelling is it that she did it, wherever she did it, whatever weapon she used, as long as it's a convincing case. So this is obviously one of the more complex and better cases. So we have Angel Starr, who does have a grudge against her, but we'll leave that to one side. She testifies that Lana stabbed the victim, which is actually true. She actually did. She took out one knife, put another knife in there. She took out the SL9 knife and put in Edgeworth's knife. So again, that's a very dumb thing to do for her. Although the only difference is there would be 2 wounds, or the shape would change, and you should be able to tell that in an autopsy sort of format. But assuming they thought it was 1 wound and she didn't stab him post-mortem, that witness testimony is very strong, and it's actually true for once. She actually did do that, just that he was actually already dead. So you do have that. She's a former detective too. That gives her some credibility. Then you have Gant coming in there. That doesn't really matter much. Then you have the Meekin situation, Jake Marshall situation. So again, the Angel Starr testimony is very strong, so I will rate that highly. She says she stabbed him, he died of a stab wound, and she really did stab him. She's not lying. Physical evidence, her fingerprints, I can't remember. I mean, you even have a picture of her there, and the witness saying she stabbed him, so I guess fingerprints don't matter at that point. But I think, doesn't she wear gloves, or does she? I feel like she wears gloves all the time, and so... Oh yeah, she wears, like, gloves the kind you use for autopsies. So her fingerprints wouldn't be anywhere. Is there any other physical evidence linking her? Assuming, I mean, obviously she was there, there's a picture, there's a witness. Is there any physical evidence tying her to the crime? Her blood is on the victim's shoe, because she cut her own hand or something. Again, clumsy defendants. Like Edgeworth picking up the gun for no reason. She had to cut herself, make her life harder. So that is strong, that her blood is mixed in with the victim's blood on the shoe. And then what else? As far as physical evidence, what else? Her scarf is there at the scene, in the muffler, and that's where the SL9 knife was. Only thing I'm confused about is circumstantial evidence. So they don't establish any reason why Lana would want to kill Goodman, do they? She hates Goodman because... why? But even without those 2, it's a very strong case, with the witness especially carrying the day. It's about equal to that, because the only thing you're missing is fingerprints. And that was also Edgeworth, of course, making the case. Did they mention motive? Let me see. motive just to mean like she didn't like Goodman because maybe of the SL9 case, but what did Goodman do that she wouldn't have liked? I don't even think there was anything. So circumstantial is weak, but you've got strong testimony from Angel and strong physical evidence with the blood on the shoe, the scarf, and pretty much everything besides fingerprints. The photo technically even counts. Shows she was there putting the body in the trunk. That's about as guilty as you can look without actually having done it. She even stabbed the knife in his body, which is just absurdly stupid to do, and cut herself at the same time. Looks like she wanted to be found guilty because that's what Gant told her to do, but she kind of gave up on life, I guess. So Meekins is involved in this when they accuse him, but that doesn't even matter. I just put that there as a placeholder.